Hello, I'm Dr. Bill Sanborn, Chief of Gastroenterology at University of California, San Diego. I'm joined today by Dr. Stephen Hanauer from Northwestern University, and our job is to discuss investigational therapies in ulcerative colitis. Steve, welcome.
Thank you, Bill.
We have a short list of things to go through. I think the first and most burning topic, perhaps, is Janus kinase or JAK inhibitor inhibition for ulcerative colitis. The product that has finished phase 3 testing is tofacitinib. Do you want to talk a little bit about what tofacitinib is used for now and what we know about it in ulcerative colitis?
Well, certainly. I mean, happily, this is a drug that's already approved and on the market for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. The Janus kinase inhibitors are a spectrum of inhibitors that impact a variety of different downstream signaling, including different interleukins and actually interferons, and can actually impact on hemoglobin, can impact on cholesterol. We find that there are a number of different effects. There are at least 5 different Janus kinase inhibitors, and while they overlap in some of their functions, they can also begin to separate. The one that we're speaking of, tofacitinib, is primarily a JAK3 inhibitor, and as I mentioned, has been approved for rheumatoid arthritis at a dose of 5 milligrams twice daily. The drug has been very effective, probably comparable to biologic agents in rheumatoid arthritis, and is distinct because it's an oral agent, and it's an oral, essentially immune suppressant for RA that has been effective. As we've learned from many other drugs that have been imported from other indications into inflammatory bowel disease, whether it's ulcerative colitis or Crohn's, we're learning that the doses required are actually higher. Now, this has several impacts. One, we have a more potent effect in our disease, but it also pushes these drugs to the potential of increased side effects. We've seen phase 2 data in ulcerative colitis that you published in the New England Journal that look quite promising, and that has recently been followed up by several phase 3 trials, both induction and maintenance in ulcerative colitis. The induction trials have been positive, and as I mentioned, the dose is somewhat higher. It's now 10 milligrams twice daily as an oral formulation for ulcerative colitis, and this has been extended into maintenance trials. Now, we haven't yet seen all of the data in the maintenance trials, but we've seen press releases from the company that suggest that they met their primary endpoints for the long-term treatment of ulcerative colitis. We haven't seen all of the long-term safety data, but if we extrapolate from our short-term data, it looks good. There is a signal for herpes zoster, but we generally see it to be quite tolerated. There is an increase in the cholesterol, in LDL cholesterol, but that can be modulated, as we've seen in rheumatoid arthritis, by cholesterol-lowering drugs. So I think it's very intriguing. We look forward to seeing the maintenance data very soon, and it's my understanding that we anticipate that this drug will be up for FDA approval in ulcerative colitis sometime in 2017. The advantages would be an oral drug that's effective in moderate to severe disease, whether or not a patient has responded to anti-TNF biologics, and we need to continue to monitor these safety signals. What else you've been one of the primary investigators. What would you have to add to that?
Well, I think I agree with everything you said. If you look from the efficacy standpoint, one of the really interesting things in the phase 3 induction trials, there were 2 of them, was that you saw a statistically significant and clinically meaningful effect in the pure anti-TNF failure population over 8 weeks, as well as in the anti-TNF naive population. And just if you recall, switching from, for instance, infliximab to adalimumab in that setting. There was very little effect for adalimumab in the anti-TNF failure patients. And in fact, the FDA only approved adalimumab in the anti-TNF naive patients. If you look at vedolizumab, it missed the endpoint in the subgroup of patients that were anti-TNF failures during induction. Eventually, they kind of caught up during the maintenance phase, but as an induction agent, it sort of missed. So this is really the first drug to show independent induction efficacy in anti-TNF failure patients, which of course is a huge unmet need for us. So I think that's kind of interesting. At the American College of Gastroenterology this fall, there were a couple of abstracts, one showing the rapidity of onset, and you do see some clinical benefit pretty early, within weeks, and then the subgroups, and there was quite a consistent effect across subgroups, with perhaps the most meaningful subgroup being the anti-TNF failure subgroup. So I think from an efficacy standpoint, that's interesting. The press release that Pfizer made about the maintenance trial, and as you said, we haven't seen the specific data publicly, but what they said was that both 5 and 10 milligrams twice daily were more effective than placebo over a year of maintenance, not only for the primary outcome measure, which would be inducing remission at the end of a year in patients who had responded initially to induction therapy, but all of the secondary endpoints, which would be maintaining response and steroid sparing and mucosal healing and all that stuff. So I think we all look forward to see just how big those effects are, but that sounds like a really consistent benefit.
And this will not likely be used in combination with other immunosuppressants. Is that correct?
I think that's right. There has been some work in rheumatoid arthritis where the use of methotrexate is kind of ubiquitous for safety, and it seemed that you could safely co-administer tofacitinib with methotrexate, but it didn't really add much to the efficacy, so what's the point? There is a small risk, maybe 1%, of neutropenia. So, you know, when you think about the drugs we're used to using, like azathioprine and mercaptopurine, or up to 10% or so of patients get neutropenic eventually, this seems to be a much better tolerated drug from a bone marrow suppression standpoint than the drugs we use all the time. But still, it has a small risk of that, and I think there's been fear of additive bone marrow depression if you were to mix the thiopurines with tofacitinib. And, you know, we usually don't like to mix two immunosuppressives together.
And the other aspect of this is that in the trials, as we've seen, this has been add-on therapy to steroids or patients who have failed other treatments. So in the study populations, it's not been given really as alone. It's been given with other concomitant medications. But I think we need to, what do you think about the safety as far as infection risk? I mentioned zoster as a signal.
Well, just to go back to that, it actually has been given alone from in a moderate number of patients. Depends on what you mean by alone.
Yeah.
The patients were not allowed to take any biologics, and they had to have washed out, and they were not allowed to take thiopurines. So the only concomitant medicines that they would have been allowed to take are mesalamine, which probably doesn't mean much in this kind of failure population setting, and probably half the patients were taking steroids.
Yeah.
So I think half the patients were not taking anything other than mesalamine. So it's close to alone.
Did we see a difference in safety, or can we discern that yet?
I don't think so. As you said, there's clearly a signal for herpes zoster that's a little higher than the background population. The interesting and good news about that is that there's a highly effective vaccine that's no longer a live virus vaccine, but an inactivated vaccine that patients will be able to be treated with, that we expect to come into the market next year. So I really think that we can think of herpes zoster as a vaccine-preventable illness now for our patients with IBD. And if that's your major safety signal, we don't need to worry much about it.
And we can add another check mark of another vaccine we need to be aware of and immunize our patients.
What you don't see is a strong signal for tuberculosis and fungal infections and some of the things that we see with TNF blockers. So I think thinking of herpes zoster as a vaccine-preventable illness, this is going to be a pretty well-tolerated drug. There's a few other drugs in the pipeline. AbbVie has ABT-474, Gilead and Galapagos have another filgotinib. Lilly has baricitinib that they're looking at. So there's at least 3 other selective JAK inhibitors, and some are going JAK1 and some are going JAK3 route. Any other ones that you know of?
No, I think those are the key ones that are under development. As you mentioned, the difference is that tofacitinib primarily inhibits JAK3, although there is some spillover. There is some interest, as you mentioned, in JAK1, which is more related to immune cells specifically and has less, should we say, off-target effects on other cell lines. So several interesting aspects of it. In the original trials with tofacitinib in Crohn's disease, it did not look as promising as it did in ulcerative colitis. Now again, this is JAK3. The other companies are also looking at the JAK1 inhibitors in Crohn's disease to see if that actually differentiates. But again, the phase 2 in Crohn's disease with tofacitinib was not positive. Although, do you think there is a role for this in Crohn's?
Well, I think there were some problems with the clinical trial design that makes it difficult to form a definitive conclusion
A great placebo.
About tofacitinib. Filgotinib, the Galapagos Gilead compound, does have a positive phase 2 study in Crohn's disease. And the AbbVie drug, ABT474, will read out at the end of the year in Crohn's disease. Those are both kind of JAK1 specific. So let's see.
Let's see.
Well, let's change gears. Another class of oral drugs that is interesting is the so-called S1P1 modulators, and the one that's in the clinic is ozanimod, and there's a multiple sclerosis drug in that class as well. Can you tell us just a little bit about, and let's make this pretty simple for a simple guy like me, how these S1P1 modulators work, and then what we know about them in ulcerative colitis?
Our colleague Maria Abreu looks at these as the Hotel California. What happens is the lymphocytes get trapped in the lymph nodes and can't get out, so it induces essentially a peripheral lymphopenia. And we've seen other drugs of a similar mechanism. So you mentioned natalizumab and most recently vedolizumab, which prevent inflammatory cells from getting out of the circulation into the tissue. Ozanimod traps these lymphocytes in the lymph nodes, and they can't get into the tissues to produce damage. As you mentioned, there have been very good results with an alternative agent in multiple sclerosis, and ozanimod is being tested in both multiple sclerosis and in ulcerative colitis. We've seen some of the phase 2 and early phase 3 results that look quite promising. And actually, you're presenting some of these at ACG. Why don't you tell us about the results?
Well, the one thing I would say is, of course, in real life, we don't like profiling, but profiling for immune cells is kind of okay.
Yeah.
So it turns out that if we think about it, vedolizumab is profiling the subset of lymphocytes that target to the gut, and natalizumab is profiling almost all lymphocytes, meaning it's not profiling at all, and of course that has some unwanted immune suppressive effects. So ozanimod is somewhere in between. It profiles and targets just a subset of the systemic immune system, but not all of it. So you get the so-called CCR, or chemokine receptor 7 positive lymphocytes, and so you have some systemic immune suppression, meaning it can affect the brain in MS and the gut and in ulcerative colitis, but you leave much of the systemic immune system intact, and we just haven't seen the infections that you see with more systemic immune suppression. So that's kind of interesting, and it's just enough and not too much.
But you've also presented some pretty compelling data, including endoscopic and even histologic healing.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting molecule. So when you think about depleting a subset of the lymphocytes as the mechanism of action, I like to refer to this as starving a fire rather than putting out a fire. So when you have an anti-cytokine or probably a JAK inhibitor, you're really blocking cytokines directly or indirectly and putting out the acute inflammatory fire. With these lymphocyte blocking or partial depleting drugs, you are preventing lymphocytes from getting into the tissue. The lymphocytes that are already there, that are already trafficked, they have a lifespan of about 90 days, and so it takes some time for them to die off. But if you don't put any more fuel on the fire, eventually the fire will die down. And that's what it kind of seems like. So we actually saw statistically significant and clinically meaningful effects at week 8 with ozanimod. But the data looked even better as you went out to week 30. And this fall at ACG, we presented data where you went out for another year. And over 80% of the patients who went into the extension trial at the end of the 30-week induction trial remained in response, and many of them in remission a year later. So this looked like a really durable treatment.
Is this a class effect of the lymphocyte trafficking drugs that it may take a little bit longer for them to work? We saw that with natalizumab in Crohn's disease. We've seen that with vedolizumab also in Crohn's disease. And now other methods of lymphocyte trafficking may just take a little bit longer.
I think I do believe that. And then what's interesting about the small molecules like ozanimod is you don't have the process of variable drug clearance and the formation of anti-drug antibodies and things that alter the effect of the drug so much. So it looks like, and we need to see this in phase 3 and with some other drugs in the class, but it kind of looks like that once you get into a response with a small molecule lymphocyte inhibitor, you can just, cruise for a long time, which would be really, if that really bears out, that's exciting.
Yes, and the potential, I'm not going to advocate it, but potential for drug holidays or on and off with these drugs that are not immunogenic, and that includes the JAK inhibitors as well. So I'm not going to advocate intermittent therapy. I'm a firm believer in maintenance treatment, but these oral agents may offer other opportunities that are not available with the monoclonal antibodies.
Now, Steve, most small molecules will have some kind of adverse event. So what are the adverse events that one might expect with ozanimod and other S1P1 modulators?
Well, the S1P1 modulators have had an effect on cardiac rhythm. And so ozanimod appears to have minimal impact on that, but that's being monitored in the clinical trials. Again, it looks good to this point regarding that. And again, the infections are going to be a potential risk, but the safety profile looks very good with ozanimod.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's at least one more drug in this class that's being tested for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. I think Arena Pharmaceutical has a drug in phase 2 for 2 indications. Some other companies are looking at it. So I suspect we'll see several drugs in this class beyond ozanimod, coming into the clinic. And I bet this class of drugs will make it eventually.
Yeah, we're going to have to figure out where we're going to position each of these agents in our expanding therapeutic cascade. But again, this availability of oral agents for moderate disease, in my opinion, I'd like to see them used actually earlier, hopefully eventually replacing steroid therapy. But we're going to have to balance the cost, the effectiveness, et cetera, with these agents.
Yeah, of course. Well, going from oral molecules back to biologics for a little while, we've had the drug vedolizumab, anti-alpha-4 beta-7 integrin antibody, in the clinic now for about 2 years in clinical practice. A lot of experience with that, and probably a lot of patients with ulcerative colitis that have been helped. There's at least 3 other molecules that are being investigated. There's anti-beta-7 or etrolizumab with Genentech. There's anti-alpha-4 beta-7, so a close sort of cousin of vedolizumab, which is Amgen and MedImmune. And there's Anti-MAdCAM 1, which is kind of the other side of the equation, initially with Pfizer and now with Shire. The one that's probably furthest along is etrolizumab. Do you want to just talk a little bit about anti-beta-7 as opposed to anti-alpha-4 beta-7?
So let's go back to some of the very basics of this. I like to consider the receptors as addressins the address to get off within the bloodstream, and the integrins, which are the target molecules on the circulating lymphocytes. And there's great specificity, as you've already alluded to, between the integrins linking to specific addressins. And we've seen that difference between natalizumab, which affects alpha-4 integrins, which are ubiquitous. They bind to VCAM, which is throughout the body and inhibits not only migration of lymphocytes from the bloodstream into the gut, but also to the brain, and that's one of the risks of natalizumab. Vedolizumab, specifically alpha-4 beta-7, which links to the receptor MAdCAM, which is limited to the gut. So we're seeing increasing specificity or profiling, as you mentioned. Beta-7 is present not only within the receptors in the gut, but also on lymphocytes within the mucosa, and can impact migration out as well as migration in. So as you mentioned, that has been being tested as a follow-up to vedolizumab's effect in ulcerative colitis. Now finally, the addressin in the gut is called MAdCAM, and there are now antibodies against that addressin that will actually impact, it's kind of the opposite. Instead of blocking the integrin on the lymphocyte, you're blocking the receptor, so they can't match. It would make sense that all of these would share a mechanism with vedolizumab, and the early trials look very promising, but we're going to have to wait for the completion of the phase 3 data. But again, you're an investigator in most of these. What additional insights can you give us?
Well, I think that's sort of what I know. It looks like, with all the limitations that we mostly have phase 2 data with these other products, the safety that we've seen with vedolizumab, which is really very good because of its gut selectivity, seems to carry through into anti-beta-7 and anti-MAdCAM-1 and the other anti-alpha-4 beta-7. So I think that's all promising. There's a Protagonist has a small molecule that targets alpha-4 beta-7. I sort of think of the anti-integrin biologics as outside in.
Yes.
That is blocking lymphocyte trafficking from the bloodstream to the gut mesentery. This other small molecule approach looks like it blocks from the inside out, so it sort of blocks alpha-4 beta-7 in the tissue and less in the blood. And of course, I would have thought that the blood would be the whole thing because once you're in the tissue, it's too late. And so it kind of raises the issue of whether there are some cell-cell interactions that are blocked by these anti-alpha-4 beta-7 integrin interactions, that even after the drug is trafficked, or the lymphocytes are trafficked, that you still might be able to block their effects somehow. This is really early days, but it's pretty interesting.
I think that's going to be very important, particularly in Crohn's disease, where we see this thick mass of inflammatory cells. We've learned in other diseases that those cells are living in a protected environment, and it's been very difficult to treat them with steroids or any other immune suppressant. And we see how long it takes, for instance, with the anti-integrins in Crohn's disease. If we can find something to mobilize or affect the cells in the tissue, I think that would be a very important advance, particularly in Crohn's.
Yeah, and the last thing on this class of drugs, vedolizumab, it's about a 30-minute infusion, so it's not so bad, but it is IV, and there are subq trials going on now, so we're hopeful in the coming years that we could have the convenience of subq dosing.
Yeah, and we're going to be, it could be possible that we've got several different or multiple drugs of the same indication, and then we're going to have to figure out which drug, which patient, which situation. It's going to get more complex for a while.
I think we're almost done. Let's just think about at a very high level what else is in clinical trials. We know that ustekinumab was just approved in U.S. and Europe for Crohn's disease. Is that being tested in ulcerative colitis?
Certainly, there are trials of both ustekinumab in ulcerative colitis. It would make sense because of the comparative mechanisms of action that we've seen. But ustekinumab is an inhibitor of both interleukin 12 and interleukin 23. there's a lot of interest now in more specific inhibition of interleukin 23, which may have more impact on the effectiveness of the drugs than the interleukin 12 component. And I know that there are several drugs that are really targeting the receptor that's specific for interleukin 23, the P40 receptor, correct?
Or the P19
No, P19,
receptor.
excuse me.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Lilly and MedImmune, Allergan, and Boehringer Ingelheim, AbbVie, each have products that targeting the P19 or anti-IL-23 cytokine that I anticipate will be tested in ulcerative colitis. So that should be really interesting. Let's see, is there anything else? I think the drug Mongersen or antisense against SMAD7 that's orally administered and is in phase 3 trials for Crohn's disease, very encouraging phase 2 data in Crohn's. I believe that's being tested in a phase 2 study for ulcerative colitis.
Yes, and I think that that's an interesting concept. There are a number of other trials underway expanding on the fecal transplants, which are a number of companies have oral probiotics or some aspect of probiotics that are actually being tested in ulcerative colitis, and I think that that's going to be maybe a long-term interest as well.
And then there's a PGE4 inhibitor that has been very successful as an oral molecule for psoriasis that I think is in phase 2 in ulcerative colitis as well, quite well tolerated.
Generally well tolerated, maybe a little nausea with that class, but again, I agree it's being tested. It looks promising as it has been in psoriasis.
I'm running out of ideas. Anything else you can think of?
Oh, that's a whole lot of information to assimilate in a short period of time. The good news is we're going to have some time to watch these trials evolve. I think we both anticipate the outcome of tofacitinib is probably the next drug that's going to be out for ulcerative colitis. The others are a bit further behind, but that'll give us experience in working with another oral class.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, that the regulatory filing would happen probably early next year, and we should expect a decision towards the end of the year. With all the caveats that any clinical use would be off-label, it is available today for arthritis, and I think that there's some evolving experience as a rescue agent in patients that have failed everything else, even in the clinic today.
Yes, and despite being an oral agent, it is priced like the biologics. So we're going to have to watch how Pfizer actually prices it as we go to higher doses in ulcerative colitis.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for joining me today and talking about the drugs in the clinical trials for ulcerative colitis.
Thank you very much.
So on behalf of Dr. Hanauer and myself, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this Investigator Insights into ulcerative colitis.